Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to be here today in Barcelona, and I'm really grateful for the honor to be invited and to see so many new things and to have wonderful talks. As you can note, I am not speaking in my language, but as already said, in English, which of course is a compromise. But I hope it works. I will turn today, this was, so to speak, the reason, the occasion of this lecture in Barcelona, to turn to iconology, to a special part of iconology which I hope to develop tonight. Iconology is in the last instance a philosophical question, because it has to do with the hermeneutics of images, and therefore is an interdisciplinary question par excellence. There are interesting efforts and projects have been to deal with iconology. I only mention Jean-Pierre Vernant, the classicist and anthropologist of the Collège de France, with his book Idole, Figure, or Jean Baudrillard in his book Les Changes Symboliques, the symbolical change. I also could mention Tom Mitchell, his book Iconologie Rancière, and above all Didi Übermann. So there are interesting efforts, studies, to conquer this field and to define it. In art history, Erwin Panofsky was one of the first, maybe the first, in his studies in iconology of 1939. And he had a very special relation in that respect to Aby Warburg, who is really the founder of iconology, I think, but did not use the term very often. My own efforts, which have been already mentioned, are twofold. The one is likeness and presence, which actually deals with the presence in images, what kind of presence is in images, and in another way, the presence of images. Likeness is a possible relation between images and what they represent. Gottfried Böhm, for instance, has the opposite approach when he speaks of iconic difference, the difference between images and what he calls reality. But all these efforts are interesting in order to circumscribe the nature and character and specific quality which images are distinguished by. In another also mentioned book, Anthropology of Images, which exists in Spanish, I dealt with the human picture making, the picture praxis as a picture making, with the picture using, with the picture seeing, and with the picture memorizing of humans. But as above all, the book dealt with the relation between images in the mental sense, mental images on the one hand, and pictures, material images. The English language happily distinguishes these pictures and images, which the German language cannot do. We have for both only the general term Bild. In that respect, also what interested me was the body as representation, because we all the time represent something or ourselves with the body, and also as an agent of representation, because our brain is the agent and place of representation. Then there was the medium which I followed, and the real significance and scope of this study was not to define, but to circle around the twofold question: what is the relation between external representation and internal representation? You know, neuroscience today uses very often the term internal representation, what we do all the time with our brain. And external representation are physical material images which sometimes are meant to represent internal representations. And thus, I dealt with two questions which in art history are not often dealt with, since art history is mostly concerned with works of art, which can be classified, exhibited, dated, and so on, but images have a much more fleeting existence. So I mention only this in order to leave it again, because what I will today do is to make a third start into iconology, in which I am not very far, and therefore this is an experiment today. This new approach I would like to call migration of images. What do we learn about images if we study migration of images? Migration in time and in space. So images can migrate from one culture to the other. They can also be memorized from one time to another. There are images before, images after. What do we learn about images? And I will a little bit discuss this question of what a migration of images means for the understanding of images. In that I use the most difficult possibility of all, the comparison with Muslim art, where things seem to be totally different and incomparable. I hope we will see that there is still a possibility to deal with Muslim art and European art. But again, I will start with Aby Warburg. Who was Aby Warburg? For those who are not familiar with his work, just a few words, because otherwise I would have to give a lecture on Aby Warburg, which I don't intend at all. Aby Warburg came from a rich banker's family in Hamburg. He was born around 1870. Then he studied art history, which was in the 19th century still something very avant-gardist to do. And then he went to Italy. He lived for a long time in Florence, and then returned in the early 20th century back to Hamburg, where in 1920 he founded the famous Warburg Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek, the Library of Culture Sciences, is an attempt to translate it, which was to be open to many disciplines in order to see that Kulturwissenschaft, comparative culture, we will come back to this, concerns many different approaches and also is concentrated on images as symbolical agents. He also, of course, edited publication series, the Warburg Studien der Bibliothek Warburg, and he died in 1929, too early. And then the sad outcome of all this was that in 1933, that is 4 years later, a library with Jewish, so to speak, appearance was no longer welcomed, and the library was then sent to Great Britain, where it was the basis of the Warburg Institute in London University. So just a few words, and then we will leave it and see in what way Warburg enters my topic. I show you just in order to give a little bit juice to this argument, two examples which I will not discuss at all. I'll just show you what could also be done if the Middle Ages were included in such images. You see two images from Venice, not really from Venice, but in Venice. The one being the Byzantine Greek epitaphios, the liturgical clothes in San Marco, and the other, Marco Basaiti, in the 16th century, which, as you can see, goes straight back to this original source, but has changed completely. And if you see the famous picture of Carpaccio in Berlin with the lament over the dead Christ, you see again it goes back to a Byzantine source, and it has changed completely and still remained somehow a memory. So in the new changed memory, there is implied, the memory of an archetype which has been reinterpreted in later times. And there is a second example, just to show what I will not discuss, but which could also be dealt with in terms of a migration of images. There is this icon in Fermo today, an imported Greek Byzantine icon, which shows the lament of the Virgin over her dead son Christ, and whose original pendant was a picture of the dead Christ. So she makes the gesture of lament. And Antonello da Vesino takes his source and reinterprets it completely, in that he represents the pregnant virgin, the Virgin in the process of becoming pregnant in the Annunciation, where the angel is missing. So you see, there is on the one hand a reference, and on the other hand a break with the earlier image, which is still somehow present, but in a way which can be dealt with in a new sense in the new image. Further, we can say, turning to Spain, there also would be very interesting examples of what happened in Spain, not in the question of migration of images, but also the omission of images or the aggression of images, the reference to images which were not dealt with at all. And this is my example from Sevilla, where you see the great geometrical surface pattern at the lower part, which is, of course, in the Alcázar, still very lively, very present, the Muslim tradition, and on the other hand, this frieze above, which has been added in the Renaissance. Now, if we look at the still Muslim-inspired monuments of Sevilla today, at least when I did it, I could not help but ask a question: why is it that pictures in the 16th and 17th centuries have a quality which is quite unusual in the kingdom, in the realm of religious images, and which show what Victor Stoichitsa, in his new collection of essays called transgression, figure de transgression. There are images in Sevilla, as you see in this example, which want to be more than images, which want to possess reality as images, and which have true hair, true clothes, and therefore somehow exert a transgression of the aesthetic difference, of the iconic difference between images and not images. Now, I was so astonished to see these images when I was 6 years ago in Sevilla that I could not help asking me the question, what is the direction? Why is it this transgression for? And there might be a local reason for this. There might be the aniconism of earlier Muslim decoration, which somehow inspired the transgression, the, so to speak, the direction, the contrast of these images, the contrast which is absolutely, there could be not a greater contrast between these images and geometrical decoration. And this contrast somehow must have a reason which we will leave by itself for the moment. You see here again in Sevilla decoration of a cupola with its squinches, which shows very well the main purpose of these squinches in Muslim art, namely to represent a surface which is three-dimensional, which is spherical, and where the light itself becomes part of geometry and somehow, so to speak, becomes active in a framework where light finds a representation. This is, so to speak, the possibility which we can at present take into consideration. Now, the same surface periodic desolation characterizes the Muslim window screen, the mashrabiyya. Its grid was meant to symbolize the entrance of light with the help of a geometrical frame, to symbolize the entrance of light with the help of geometrical frame that spreads and wanders over the walls of an interior. You see a photograph of a modernist architect in Egypt, Hassan Fatih, which is very interesting to study a very central place for defining a culture, that is the window. You see here the window is a place where light enters an interior and creates, by this tessellation and surface, patterns and, to speak, images, abstract images on the walls of an interior. 15th century miniature painting, to which we will come now, windows are represented as closed screens that are reflecting the eternal light. You see in this instance here a typical representation of a window, which is not closed and is also not open in our sense. It's something in a third sense, namely it is a screen with its pattern and defines the light as an entering force which is behind the window and comes into an interior. You will all know the Las Galegas of Murillo, where, as you speak, Hans Belting is standing in front of the picture because he is looked at. So this is very important. The window is used in a double sense. It helps me to look into an interior, and from the interior somebody looks out to me. Namely, not only is this nice girl who looks at me, there is the other girl who opens the shutter of the window and somehow discloses her face. So this is a drama of visibility, a drama of look and contra-look between two looks, which emphasizes the role of the window as a symbolic form that also is taken to the picture as a window. That is, the picture in the West, so to speak, functions as a symbolical window. Today, other routes of image migration have come into sight, which I must leave out in this context. I only mention the attempts of contemporary Chinese artists like Miao Xiaochun to rethink and to recreate European masterpieces, such as Michelangelo's Last Judgment or Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delight, in the language of digital media in the global age. But Warburg invites us to take his vision of a comparative approach to cultures, to quote him again, literally in a novel way, which in his own days he could not foresee. and that it therefore becomes an urgent task to extend, I quote, the methodological borders in both material and spatial terms, to quote Marburg a last time. Thank you very much.